Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics.
All right. We're here with Professor Andrew Leach from the University of Alberta. He's an energy economist, and I figured we would talk about the clean fuel standard because that came into effect this week. The opposition likes to call this carbon tax 2. The Atlantic premiers are freaking right out about it right now, and so I figured I would get Andrew to explain some of what is actually happening. Andrew.
Sure. So thanks for the setup. I mean, I think there's a couple of things that are going on. First, there's clean fuel standard, and then there's also the application of the federal carbon tax in some of the Atlantic provinces. So there's at the request, at least in some cases, of those Atlantic provinces. So there's sort of two things going on in Atlantic Canada that are different than what's going on in the rest of the country, which is, as you say, the application of the clean fuel regulations, which target a couple things. They target renewable fuel blending, they target more electric vehicle use, they target carbon capture and storage. And so, as you say, the conservative opposition has labeled it as a second carbon tax. I think the reason why they're characterizing it that way is essentially for the same reason as they have been all along, is this is something which, even according to the government's own projections, is going to affect the cost of delivering gasoline into the Canadian market. So
Right.
the expectation here, elsewhere, et cetera, is that you have some effect at the pump, but it's not as clear as the carbon tax or carbon price where it's a specified fuel charge. So the opposition is playing a little bit on that uncertainty. And then the government, on the other hand, is being a little bit casual about, well, we hope these costs won't get passed on to consumers. And generally, we know that most of those, whether it's crude oil costs or refining costs, or in this case, fuel regulation, fuel blending, et cetera, those are going to flow through mostly to consumers. So there's a little bit for everybody in this one, I think.
All right. I guess when it comes, so I get, yeah. First of all, this is not a tax, quote unquote, because there's no actual set price being applied here. This is all refineries that are largely refiners that would be passing on costs.
Yeah, and this is kind of, the type of regulation that historically the conservatives have talked about. The Harper government had a renewable fuel standard, for example, that forced blending of biodiesel and ethanol into gasoline stocks and offered some flexibility. So if you didn't meet your own obligations, you could buy credits from someone who overcomplied. That's basically what the clean fuel standard does as well. So this is of that sort of flexible regulations variety that maybe appeals more to conservatives, at least those that want action on climate change. So, if you were going to take issue with something as a conservative, this one is actually pretty close to the kind of sector by sector regulatory approach or the flexible regulations that we've seen. But, in today's world with inflation and cost of living challenges, everything stops at, does this add cost? Yes, let's call it a tax. Even if the government doesn't collect any revenue from it at all, we're going to call it a tax. And I think that's where the debate gets a little bit silly.
Okay. All right. Part of what is also, I think, fueled this is the parliamentary budget officer had a report several weeks ago, which was kind of I think he called it a distributional analysis of what the impact of this standard might look like, which went out to 2030. But I've noticed the opposition, or the conservatives in particular, have played a little fast and loose with some of those numbers. I know, however, that report was somewhat controversial. I'm wondering if you can just kind of explain why.
Yeah, I mean that everybody agrees there are going to be costs here, and so I think and we know that generally speaking, as a percentage of people's income or percentage of people's budgets, you put prices of energy up, that tends to affect low income or lower income Canadians more dramatically. So the disagreements in the analysis, I think there are a couple places. One, the PBO doesn't account for any benefit associated with the carbon emissions reduction. So it's sort of, let's talk about how the costs are distributed. And they jump into that really old trope about, well, Canada's only 1.6% of global emissions, and so we're not going to count any benefits from this at all. The federal analysis, on the other hand, does account for global climate change damages in assessing the benefits, but it uses older estimates. And so those older estimates show the policy essentially as being a social benefit or negative social benefit because the cost of the emissions reductions are greater than the old estimates of those global benefits. New numbers are better, or new numbers are higher, which makes the policy look like a social welfare improving policy in a way that it didn't before. So, the PBO, I think, has been rightly criticized for not including climate damages. But then, at least in my view, I went back through the PBO's website and said, well, what other policies are they doing these distributional analyses for? And, there are a few of them out there, but anything that has anything to do with climate change, all of a sudden there's the PBO doing distributional analysis, which I guess we could argue about whether that's their mandate, but it's also there's also this very interesting dive into a little bit of the choice of policy mechanism that I wouldn't think was the PBO's mandate.
Okay, well, that's interesting to know. I guess one of the other things that has kind of been around this particular policy is we've had the environment minister say that refineries shouldn't pass these costs on because they're making high margins, and he's also said canola farmers love this because their crops can be used in the biofuels. So we're getting a lot of this kind of talk, but I don't know that it's necessarily penetrating. And I'm wondering if you can, I guess, just talk around some of these other issues that the government is sort of mentioning, but they haven't really kind of made their case for it.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a challenging file for the government because it is telling people to change their behavior. And by definition, businesses, refineries, whatever they are, they're pursuing the cheapest way to deliver a fuel product that people want. So if you're saying, I'm going to now take you and I'm going to tell you to do something different, that's going to change your cost structure. And they're not charities, right? They're not going to just say, oh, well, you're right. We'll take that on and we're not going to pass it on to consumers. So I think the government itself is a little bit hamstrung in that regard, especially this question of, well, they're not going to pass it through because their profits are really high. If that's what you're worried about, and maybe that's a little bit of a nod to Jagmeet Singh and the windfall tax and that sort of discussion. But if that's your worry, I mean, we have profit taxes. But this isn't a profit tax. This is a straight cost of production or cost of blending change, or on some cases, it's an advantage. So for things like carbon capture and storage, it makes that more valuable. So it's not designed to trim profits or really to change prices as much as it is to influence behavior, and some of those behaviors have costs.
Okay. All right. I think last question here is the thing that I always find with some of these conversations around trying to lower emissions is I'm reminded of some of the mining stories around Sudbury and how they made some changes to their smokestacks and whatever, and they wound up not only improving the air that they were emitting, but lowering their own costs along the way. And I'm wondering if this is something that is it possible for that kind of a thing to happen with refineries in this particular case, or is that possibly being too hopeful?
I think it's probably being too hopeful on the clean fuel regs. I think there is some opportunity for costs be lower than we expect for something like carbon capture and storage, or as we've seen for renewable power, that deployment has happened at lower cost than people expected, but it's just now getting to the point where it's cheaper. I think in the fuel space, if blending ethanol and biodiesel were cheaper, people would be doing it already, and people would be doing it en masse. So I don't think that's as big a possibility. That's sort of what we call the Porter hypothesis, where all of a sudden you learn that there's this other way to do things, and yeah, it's great. But I do think there's another history that's probably more connected, which is whenever these kinds of policies come in. I mean, you mentioned acid rain, that's a big one. Business has this. Well, if we implement this in the way that we can envision implementing it today, and we keep doing that forever, here's how many trillions of dollars it's going to cost, and here's how many people we're going to have to lay off, and we're never going to produce whatever in this country again. And I think generally our evidence is that that's not true. That, in the same way as, all of the, whether it's, the churches or whomever that we're going to close down over the carbon tax, it turns out maybe it wasn't quite as costly as we imagined. And it turns out we, had a couple of extra zeros in there. We don't have to shut down after all. And I think that's probably more likely what you'll see here. You'll probably see some innovation on the fuel side of things as well that makes some of the supply more available at lower cost. But it's hard to see this being something that everyone's surprised and this is a new way to do things, and we're all going to be happier.
All right. Well, thanks for taking
our emissions will be lower, so that's a plus.
Yes, indeed. So thanks again for taking the time to do this, and do it again.
Sounds good.
And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. It's at Journo_Dale on Twitter, assuming it's still around much longer. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.